I'm Barbara Freed. I'm a member of the Stanford Law School faculty as well as the advisory board of the Stanford Ethics Center. Among its many other public roles at Stanford, the Ethics Center sponsors the annual Wesson Lecture on Problems of Democracy. The lecture series was endowed by the late Robert Wesson, a distinguished political scientist who was a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute from 1978 until his death in 1991. It was Wesson's hope in endowing these lectures that they would provide an opportunity for the greater Stanford community to think through important challenges facing democracy. This year, the Wesson Lecture coincides with a kickoff of a year-long series on the ethics of democracy, sponsored by the Ethics Center in conjunction with departments across the university. Tomorrow afternoon, Congressman Frank will be participating in the second event of the series, a panel on congressional gridlock and the future of bipartisanship. He will be joined by Congressman Mickey Edwards and Congressman Dan Lundgren, both former representatives of districts in California. The event, also free and open to the public, will be from 4 to 5:30 at Cubberley Hall on campus. You can get the details about this event and a number of other forthcoming events in the Ethics of Democracy series. I'm so sorry, 5:30 to 7. I apologize. Tomorrow, 5:30 to 7 at Cubberley Hall. You can get details on this event and a number of other forthcoming events in the Ethics of a Democracy series on the Ethics Center website. Now to the business at hand. Our past Wesson lecturers have included some of our greatest interpreters of democracy in theory and in practice. Among past holders of the lectureship, there include Robert Dahl, John Rawls, Noam Chomsky, Theda Skocpol, Orlando Patterson, the Honorable Richard Posner, Ronald Dworkin, Nancy Rosenblum, Senator Russ Feingold, and Eric Foner. We are honored to welcome to that august company this year's Wesson lecturer, Congressman Barney Frank. In 1967, Barney Frank, then a 27-year-old graduate student in the government department at Harvard, took a short leave of absence from the PhD program to run Kevin White's mayoral campaign in Boston. When the campaign was over and White had won, Barney Frank was all set to return to Harvard to get to work on his thesis when he got a call from Kevin White asking him to be his chief of staff. After extracting a second extension from the government department at Harvard, Frank accepted White's offer. After a few years on that job, he returned to Harvard to start work in earnest on his putative thesis. Frank's description, not mine. But bolted a mere 6 months later to work for Congressman Michael Harrington. You all know how the story ends. We've all dealt with graduate students like this, and they never amount to anything. Congressman Frank, I'm afraid, is no exception. But for those of you who are curious what became of him, here's the story in brief. In 1972, he ran for the Massachusetts State House of Representatives, a position he held for the next 8 years until 1980. In 1980, Barney Frank ran for an open seat in Congress that was vacated by Robert Dryden, a longtime Democrat from Massachusetts. He won that election and went on to serve in Congress for 32 years until his retirement in 2013. During his tenure, he was widely regarded as one of the smartest, most influential politicians in Washington. As chairman of the Financial Services Committee from 2007 to 2011, Frank helped craft a series of landmark legislation in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, culminating in the eponymously named Dodd-Frank Bill, a sweeping reform of bank regulation. Throughout his career, he has been a stalwart champion of those most in need of a champion in government, including the poor, the homeless, racial minorities, gays and lesbians, and veterans. Congressman Frank was also, thank you Wikipedia, a fan favorite among congressional staffers who repeatedly voted him the brainiest, funniest, and most eloquent member of the House, and on one occasion, the runner-up for workhorse. I pity the person he lost to. If I may add a personal note here, I lived in the Boston area in the 1970s and 1980s and was privileged to be represented by Congressman Frank, or Barney as he was universally known among his constituents, in his first 2 terms in Congress. I'm afraid to say that that experience has spoiled me for life. Whether you agree with him or not on particular policy issues, one thing is not debatable. Congressman Frank has been the consummate public servant, devoting his formidable talents and inexhaustible energy to pursuit of that much abused concept, the public interest. So I guess I am forced to concede, after all, that perhaps academia's loss has been the country's gain. The title of Congressman Frank's lecture tonight is "To Govern is to Choose: Policing the Globe versus Improving the Quality of our Lives." After the lecture, Professor Bruce Kane of the Political Science Department will join Congressman Frank on stage for a brief discussion, and then Congressman Frank will take questions from the audience. At the close, he will be signing copies of his recently released autobiography, A Life in Politics, outside of the CMEX Center. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Barney Frank.
Thank you. I have been in a lifelong war with the physical world, and it has been exacerbated by the proliferation of technology. I am also, as I will mention briefly, easily distracted. So could someone shut this thing off so I am not tempted to read? These are very nice honors undergraduates, and I'm glad to look at them. But if you got somebody who can come, go, can I just pull it? No, I can't get it down. I'm serious. If someone would come and shut this off, I would be. Oh, they are? Okay, thank you. Actually, I was going to say that my decision not to go back to academia, or not to stay when I went back after a 3-year stint. By the way, for members of the Political Science Department who might be interested in the intricacies of history, the indefinite extension I got for my thesis was granted by the then chairman of the Harvard Government Department, who was a neighbor of Mayor Kevin White, Professor Samuel Huntington, who actually did a stint here, I remember, when my brother, who was a class of 71 at Stanford, had attended. But what happened was I went back to Harvard, and I did still think of myself as an academic. And I made a self-discovery then, and you're asked often to give career advice to young people. You're generally asked to give career advice to young people by other old people who don't realize that the young people have not the faintest interest in your telling them things. But there is one thing that I do try to insist on them that is very important. That is, know yourself, and in particular, try to figure out what you are good at and what you are not good at. And then if you are lucky, you make your living by doing the things you are good at. And in my case, I have a very deep-seated characteristic, which I've just shown you an example of, I hadn't intended to before, which made me very ill-suited to be an academic, but ideally, temperamentally, to be first the chief of staff to a political official and then a member of the legislature. In both cases, you have a very broad range of substantive responsibilities and not enough time adequately to discharge any of them. And I have a very short attention span. I'm serious. For an academic, that is a handicap. For someone in my line of work, where if you have an hour to spend on one issue, that is a lot, and you can't keep jumping around, it's a very good thing. So that's why I decided that I would stay in politics. As to the topic today, and problems of democracy, by the way, again, for a political science department, I don't know if there are any specialists in comparative politics, particularly Western European. If there are, you will maybe remember the man who gave me the title, and it really is something I've cared strongly about. But I have translated a book that was entitled Gouverner, c'est choisir, which was the memoir of Pierre Mendès-France, who was a very effective socialist prime minister of France in the 50s. Unfortunately, did not survive the chaos of French politics. But I've translated that a little bit more easily. In fact, I'm very proud in Ben Bernanke's memoir, and he talks about our relationship and our work together. But there was one part of Ben Bernanke's, one passage in his book in which he quotes what I think people would think an unlikely source for him. As I look around in this audience, sometimes my audiences in university communities don't get the reference. I think you will. He quotes a man I consider a great 20th century philosopher, Henny Youngman. Comedian back in the days when it was, you made fun of your wives and mothers-in-law, etc. And he had what was considered the shortest joke in history. Take my wife, please. But there was one that he had that was really quite profound. How's your wife compared to what? That and to govern is to choose have been the guidelines, and I say this for I think particularly appropriate in an ethics program. Compared to what is the only responsible approach you can take in trying to make public policy decisions. And Bernanke quotes me as saying that, and I have to say I will cite, I suppose, at some point one of my minor achievements as having brought about the alliance in Yiddish, for those who know it, the shidduch, the arranged marriage between Ben Bernanke and Henny Youngman. I think that is a significant accomplishment, and Ben acknowledged that that is, in fact, a very important way to deal with it. But the question is, what threatens our democracy? And I'm going to link a couple of things. It is clear that our democracy is in a pretty rough patch, and I guess the best example of that, without taking ideological sides at this point, or will later, it is what is striking, and people have noticed it, is what is by contemporary, by historical standards, by people's expectation of American politics, the inherent implausibility of some of the leading presidential candidates. I mean, leave aside whether you think that's good or bad, but it really comes out of, I guess, not left field, but left field, right field, the bleachers, and whatever. And so the question is, what is it that has made people in such a different mood? And I believe there is a danger there, because I think a lot of it is anger, which is not itself irrationally caused, but which is somewhat irrationally expressed. And people are really, really pissed. And what that has done, I think, is cloud their judgment. I should add at this point that I am not one of those members of the left politically, and I am a man of the left politically, who comforts himself with the view that if only the politicians would listen to the public, we will resolve our problems. Some of you may have seen an excellent column by Paul Krugman, who has become not just an economist, but one of the smartest commentators on public affairs, in which he said to many of those on the left, and he's also a man on the left, stop taking a lot of comfort in the fact that the only problem is big money, and that if it weren't for big money distorting public opinion, we would win a lot of things. Now, big money is a problem. I would like to repeal the Citizens or overrule the Citizens United decision. But the fact is, there are public attitudes. There is racism, there is nativism, there are a number of other attitudes. There's a sort of selfishness that we have had to deal with, and I've had to deal with in my 50 years in politics, even without money. Let me throw in one example, which I think some of my friends on the left again feel too comfortable about. The reason we have not been able to enact sensible gun regulation has very little to do with campaign contributions. The National Rifle Association is the most effective lobbyist in our society because of the intense feeling of their followers. What the National Rifle Association is able to do is to intimidate members of Congress and legislatures by the fear that they will be defeated. It has very little to do with money. By the way, if you look at it, the average gun owner is not rich. You are talking about a segment socioeconomically that's not the wealthiest, but it is strong public feeling that allows the NRA to do that. I was honored to be included in the list that included Robert Dahl, the political scientist. Some of you may not be familiar with his work, but he is a man who pioneered in explaining the concept of intensity in political affairs. Namely, and this is a paradox, very often when you take a public opinion poll of the country in its entirety, the side of the issue that is in the minority loses electorally, or wins electorally. The majority loses, not because of any campaign finance problem, but because what counts is not what people think, but how deeply they think it. If you're a politician and you're calculating where the political advantage is on an issue, and all politicians, there's a spectrum. Some of my former colleagues, that's all they care about. But even the most dedicated, even the fiercest, you do not ignore the opinion of the people whom you represent, either ethically or practically. People who say, oh, I mean, it's a factor. You may have your own strong views. You may work very hard for them. But at some point, you have to check public opinion. You can, as a member of Congress, an elected official, you can defy strong public opinion once, twice. By the third or fourth time you've told people you fundamentally disagree with them on something that's very important to them, they're not going to re-elect you, and they probably shouldn't if we believe in democracy. So it's one principle I will enunciate early on. If we really believe that an issue should not be decided with regard to political considerations, we should not ask 535 politicians to make it. When you do, you're going to get the politics in there. So if you're calculating politically, how's this going to affect me? You do not care what the public thinks, because you are interested not in opinion in general, but only in that opinion which is likely to motivate voting behavior. People in this audience have a lot of opinions on a lot of issues, none of which are going to affect how you vote. There are a much smaller number that will drive your vote. Unfortunately for the proponents of gun regulation, maybe it'll change at some point, most of the proponents of gun regulation have a broader set of concerns than the opponents of gun regulation. There are a large number of people in the country who only care about protecting their unrestricted right to buy guns. And they outvote the others in that sense. So this is the framework in which we are operating. And it is clear that the anger that exists today, and we've always had these issues, but there is an anger that has exacerbated our problems. And the causes of the anger, the single biggest cause, I think is pretty clear. It is the sense of unfairness. It is the sense that as the economy has progressed, as we have gotten wealthier as a society, the benefits of that wealth have been unfairly and unduly concentrated, and that is accurate. We do have excessive inequality. And I say excessive, you need inequality to have a capitalist system. There's no question about it. But you can get too much inequality, which we now have and have had for a while, and it has two negative consequences. First of all, it really does deprive a lot of people of the ability to live as they should. Secondly, it becomes economically inefficient. The more of the economic wealth that is concentrated in the hands of the few, the weaker will be your economic growth, because as much as they would like to, they can't spend it. When you cut back on a broader distribution, you get hurt. Example, in 2011, Barack Obama succeeded in forcing the Congress to increase taxation on upper-income people. There was also the lapsing of a tax break for lower-income people. Namely, we had, to fight the recession, knocked off a couple of pennies on the Social Security tax, which saves working people. And then that came back. And in the period after that, as it began to take effect, there was no diminution in the amount of money spent by the very rich, because they had more money than they knew what to do with. Even though we raised taxes on them, it did not stop them from spending. But the snapback into a higher tax rate for people at the lower level did have an economic slowdown, because these were people who spent everything they can. So the more money that goes to people who don't spend a lot of it because they don't need to, and the less that goes to people who spend because they have to, the worse off you are in your overall economic situation. The problems with inequality are partly due to the economy. In America, there is this great problem of taking the exception for the norm. Thomas Piketty, in his Capitalism in the 20th Century, talks about this. He talks about how people in France took the glorious 30 years as if they were the norm. Here was the problem in America. When World War II ended, America was in the most extraordinarily dominant economic position as anybody maybe had ever been. Because as terrible as World War II was for us in personal terms, economically it was wonderful. Because every other advanced society was severely damaged in loss of manpower and in physical damage. We, on the other hand, suffered no physical damage after Pearl Harbor, and we stoked up our economy. Very interesting, by the way, because it was also the beginning of the understanding that excluding women and black people from economic production was not a very good idea. And they began to get hired, and that helped some. But the basic point was this: America had geared up to be able to sell anything, anywhere, to the rest of the world. That lasted for many years after World War II. People don't immediately snap back. So from 1945 on in particular, we were able to cut back on our military production, and we could make steel and glass and automobiles and anything and sell it anywhere in the world. Which meant that if you were an American, if you were a white male, because we still had the problems against minorities and women, but if you were a white male willing to work, you could go get a very good job. You could go to an industrial plant and make money and get a good life. You could buy a vacation home, you could send your kid to school, you could build for your retirement. And that was true for America from the 40s to the 70s. People still see that as the norm. What then happens is the rest of the world catches up to us, in part because you get the oil-producing nations agreeing they're going to raise the price of oil, hurts us some, but also because now Japan, France, Germany, Italy, England, countries that were not producing anything in 1945 have now reverted to a natural ability to produce. And that's even especially the case in parts of Asia. So we can't compete nearly as much as we can. And what happens is, and this has been the case for 40 years, and you see it now in the trade bill, America still makes more money, but it's not going to everybody in America. As the terms of trade are there, if you are an American increasingly with a lot of education and high technical skills, you do good because we're selling to the rest of the world. If you are an American who simply has a willingness to work and do basic labor, you don't do as good because there are people elsewhere in the world who will compete with you. They don't compete as much at the high end. So that has been part of the problem. Trade, and it's now recognized for a long time, free trade, reciprocal trade, that was a great liberal value. And what's now very clear, and there's some studies that are showing it, even the one from the Peterson Institute that the Obama administration points to, trade does two things. It increases the overall wealth of America, but it exacerbates the inequality with which that wealth is distributed. People at the high end, people in Silicon Valley, people in the entertainment industry, people in a lot of other high-end places, people in the medical area. People at the high end, we do very well from trade. But people who are in manufacturing and increasingly in the kind of services that can be sent overseas don't do as well. And so the natural workings of the economy, exacerbated by trade policy, have made things worse. Now, there have been some political added additions to that. It is not sufficiently noticed that the successful Republican war on labor unions has been a contributing factor in undermining wages. But anyway, that's where we are. Increasing public anger. Now, the anger was fueled by a couple of other things. People were feeling angry, and then came the economic crisis of 2008. And I have to say that President Obama's luck is among the worst of any president. He's the kind of anti-Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt took office after the Great Depression, which Herbert Hoover was blamed for. Unfortunately for Obama, the crisis came just as he was taking over. He didn't have a period of people to be miserable in between. You know, the crash of 29, Roosevelt doesn't take over till 33. People understand this was Hoover. Barack Obama presided over what I believe was a very successful effort to deal with the crisis. I talk to people who have a question. I believe what's the TARP program, which lent money to the banks, which was repaid with a profit, will go down in history as the most unsuccessful the most unpopular, highly successful program the federal government ever did. But Obama gets blamed for all that. You will hear Democrats and Obama blamed for the bailouts. There were 5 bailouts during that period, everyone initiated by George W. Bush. But we got the blame for them. So there was this factual shift in the distribution within the economy, so that people at the lower end were doing worse and people at the higher end were doing better, and a greater share of the increased prosperity was going to wealthy people. There was great anger that there was irresponsibility on the part of the financial community among the richest, which caused a problem, and which people saw the government helping them and not doing enough. I think some of that narrative is wrong. I think we did do a very good job. If you've got yesterday's New York Times, there's an article by Stephen Eisman, who was a very constructive figure during this period. He, as he notes, was played by Steve Carell in The Big Short. And he talks about how much good we've done with our legislation, how much we have improved things. But I understand that's not the perception. And there was a moment in time when I believe the anger crested. In April of 2009, American International Group, the entity that needed to get $170 billion from the Federal Reserve to pay for its loans, by the way, an entirely George Bush production. Congress had nothing to do with that. They announced that they were paying bonuses. This is a group that needed federal money, and they were paying bonuses to the people who had caused the problem. I have never seen the American people so angry. I was chairman of the committee. I really feared for our capacity to govern. And I believe if you go back, and people will do this historically, at that moment, the anger just froze over. And we have since then, and we then, things got better, but it's not an accident. Excuse me. I thought I had turned my phone off. I told you, I'm not very good with these things. It is in 2010 that the Tea Party starts. The Tea Party had a baptism. There was a right-wing, irresponsible guy on CNBC named Santelli who ranted, to use the technical term, on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Why should I help somebody else pay their mortgage when I am paying my own without help? Let's have a tea party. So what you have is the combination of economic reality, which redistributes within America, and this anger that the richest people, the people who've been the beneficiary of the redistribution, cause a problem and are, in the public mind, rewarded for it. Jesus, I just shut this. I'm sorry. Supposed to shut off. You get an anger. And here's the sad part. The anger then becomes, it's reasonable to be angry. I said the anger was rational, but it's exercise, it's evinced irrationally. The anger becomes not at specific public policies that have caused the problem, or at the people who have pushed them. The anger becomes, and too many people on the left have joined in this, at government in general. And here is the great paradox. We will not diminish inequality. We will not protect people further against financial abuse, although I will argue we have done a great deal of that, without a strong government. But the problem is the angrier people are at the existing conditions, the angrier they are at government. The angrier they are at government, the less we are able to do the things that will alleviate their anger. So they get angry and they do less government. What happens is people are so angry at conditions that they elect to office precisely those people who will exacerbate what it is they are upset about. And the question is, what do you do about it? Well, I think there is a solution. I am convinced that if we were able to empower ourselves to act together, that's government. Government is not some alien, separate entity. Government is what we call it when we collaborate and do things together. If we could re-engage together, we could adopt public policies that would begin to diminish the inequality, that would therefore be a virtuous cycle instead of a vicious cycle. People would feel better. And here's the problem. And there are things we could do. We could make it easier for people to get education. We could reduce the cost of health care. We could compensate the victims of trade. It's interesting, this Peterson Institute study that the Obama administration welcomes, it shows how the Trans-Pacific trade agreement will improve the overall economy, but they can see that there are a lot of workers who will get hurt by it. And they said, so the thing to do is to adopt policies that help them, but we haven't got the money to do that. There are things that aren't hard that we could do. There are other important things we could do. One of the obstacles now to combating climate change is that in the short term, some of the things you will do to combat climate change will have a negative effect on some people who have, through no fault of their own, been engaged in the entirely illegal activity of making the climate worse. Coal miners are not bad people. They didn't say, how can I ruin the earth? These were people who didn't have a lot of choice. There were others who are engaged in these things. The people who wanted to build the pipeline from Canada weren't bad people. These were construction workers who needed to feed their families and have money. If we had sufficient public funds, we could find alternative things for them to do. Well, I'll tell you one of the things about inequality, it's going to be very hard to change the economy in the short term to make it less unequal. But here's one way you deal with inequality. You diminish the negative effects of inequality. That is, if you are now on the low end, you have problems with housing and health care and education. Let's do more in general to help people with their health care. Let's increase the subsidies. I do not think, and I'm on the other side from Bernie Sanders at this point, talking about single payer universally, I think, gets us nowhere. But we came very close, people have forgotten this during the healthcare debate, of reducing the Medicare age to 55, an incremental issue. One of the good things that President Obama did was to expand Medicaid. I don't think we can get the single payer all at once, but you know, you go down this way and up this way, and pretty soon only people who are 37 won't have it. But that alleviates it. You can diminish the cost of higher education. One of the problems we have with higher education, you know this very well here in California, is that the states, which have been the primary supporter of public higher education, don't have the money to do that anymore. The prisons have eaten the lunch of the universities. Now, one good thing we can do is, of course, reduce the number of people in prison. And that is, I am pleased to say, going forward, there is this silly conceit that people say, oh, I don't like to say I told you so. In fact, everybody I know likes to say I told you so. I have found it is one of the few pleasures that improves with age. I can say I told you so without taking a pill before, during, or after I do it. And I told you so in a couple of areas. I filed a bill to legalize marijuana in 1972. And I think the country is catching up to this. And by the way, let me just, as an aside, please do not pay any attention to the people who say, well, the way we're going to deal with this, probably some of the Republicans having second thoughts about getting people out of prison who really are no threat to anybody else and don't need to be there. We'll house them, we'll imprison them more cheaply, we'll spend less. I have been confronted by people who say, well, how come it costs more to send someone to your maximum security prison than to send them to a first-rate state university? And the answer is very simple. Very few people try to escape from the state university. That has an inherent expense to it that you cannot get rid of. But we could provide publicly for more of what people need in healthcare and education. We could do more to construct housing publicly. But by the way, in housing, this is an example. Part of the problem is we don't have the money. Part of the problem is public attitudes. I've spent more of my time trying to build affordable housing over time, and one of the biggest single obstacles has been the bigotry of people who don't want those poor people living near them. And it's excessive, and it drives up the cost. But you could also provide more public work. If we were trying to improve or diminish inequality, one way to do it was to give people who are willing to work very good jobs. One of the dumbest public policies we've had, internationally, there's no contest. The single dumbest thing America ever did was to invade Iraq. But domestically, at a time when interest rates are low and you can borrow money cheaply, to refuse to put a lot of money into building highways and mass transit and bridges is ridiculous, including raising the gas tax a couple of pennies. I mean, the fact is the gas tax has come down so much we could have done that. That also, by the way, people rant about increasing productivity. That's not easy to do. But cutting down traffic jams, moving goods more quickly, getting people to work better, that improves productivity. And it also would provide good jobs. Construction jobs are good jobs. And today, unlike 60 years ago when Eisenhower was pushing it, those jobs would be more widely distributed. The building trades are no longer a white male preserve. There are women and minorities who are in the building trades. So there are things we can do. But here is the problem. Unless we can find a source of money, we can't raise taxes. People hate government, so they're not going to let the government spend any more money. I believe, to recap this, the problem we're facing now, the threats to that many people see to our democracy, the anger, the hatred, the excessive success for irrational, angry politics is fueled in part by anger over the last few years and also by the fact that the economy is so constructed that it is unfair and a lot of people are badly stressed. We could begin to alleviate that if I could find $100 billion a year to be distributed to the federal and state governments. I guarantee you we could come together on programs that would begin to make real improvements in people's lives. It would be good for the economy because it would be stimulative in the right way, and it would begin to diminish the anger. So where are you going to get it? Two places. One, I just alluded to. I wish my conservative colleagues applied to the war on drugs the skepticism they apply to the war on poverty. Imprisoning people because they swallow things we don't like has not worked very well, either to stop them from swallowing those things or doing anything else. Certainly marijuana is an easy one, but I believe that if we were to stop treating the ingestion of these substances as a crime, we would do better. I would make this one amendment. We can, I think, we should prevent people, if we can, from taking substances, the ingestion of which make people behave antisocially. That is not true, by the way, not only of marijuana, but of heroin and cocaine. People who use heroin don't hit other people over the head because they use heroin. They hit other people over the head so they get the money to buy the heroin that we've made it hard for them to get. There is one substance that does cause people to behave, in many cases, irresponsibly, that you can make an argument for banning, but we tried it once and it didn't work, and that's, of course, alcohol. Tell a cop that there's a group of teenagers or guys in their 20s being somewhat noisy, 2 o'clock in the morning in a certain place, and they've been drinking beer. And the cops are going to approach them somewhat carefully. They might have their hands on their batons. You tell them that they've been smoking dope, and the cops will probably bring them potato chips. Talk to any police officer. Would you rather deal with someone who may have had too much marijuana or someone who has had too much to drink? And of course, they will take the marijuana situation. That would save some money, which you know this in California, in prisons. But that's more at the state and local level. Nationally, we could save, I said $100 billion a year, probably could be 150 after a while. It is time for us, and this is the part of my title, to recognize that there is neither the need or the capacity for us to be in charge of bringing order to the world. I am sorry that other people do not govern themselves well. The notion that we can resolve that through the American military is nonsense. We have the best military in the history of the world. It is very good at doing what a military can do. It can stop bad things from happening. It cannot make good things happen. It cannot make Shia and Sunni like each other. It cannot end corruption in Afghanistan. It cannot bring coherence to South Sudan. It just cannot. There is nothing you can do from the outside. And in fact, there's even a kind of a rule. If there is a civil war going on, and the people we would rather see govern that country are losing to the other side, and we intervene to help the losing side, we can never get out. Because if they were losing until we got in, what do you think is going to happen when we get out again? They're going to lose again. And here is the deal. So it's probably, we can't do it. Secondly, there is no self-interest in doing it. Now, that may sound a little callous. I wish people could be better. But Saddam Hussein was a bad guy who governed Iraq badly. It did not have any negative impact on the United States. Now, if in fact we could easily have resolved it, that's one thing. But prudence comes into it. People say, well, you should just do what you have to. If you were walking down the street and a child was being attacked by a fairly small dog, you would intervene. If the child was being mauled by a bear, you would call somebody to try to help. You would not sacrifice your own life uselessly to do it. That is, we get involved, and I know I'm in a political science department. I've made a conversion. When I was younger and studying political theory, there were 2 sort of opposing political scientists around the time of the 16th and 17th century, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Thomas Hobbes argued that both of them believed, unlike previous thought, that human beings had a right to step in and say to God, okay, it's not up to you anymore, it's up to us. The previous view was God is ruling everything. And these people said, no, we have the right to step in. But Hobbes had narrower goals. Hobbes said we got to step in to prevent ourselves from killing each other. So without a strong government, he said, his book was called Leviathan, life will be nasty, brutish, and short. A description which is often applied to certain politicians, but in this case it was society. John Locke had broader and higher hopes. He said we come together to adopt a civil society in which we respect each other's rights. And I thought when I was young, it's obvious, we're Lockeans, not Hobbesians. We're not going to settle for just maintaining order. And I still think that is the goal. But we have to recognize that there are societies which are not going to be able to live up to lock, and in which it is necessary to have a government to prevent people from killing each other. I acknowledge two mistakes in my foreign policy judgments. One, I was wrong. George H.W. Bush was right. His intervention in Kuwait to drive out Saddam Hussein made sense because it was restrained. He did not move on to Baghdad. And the reason it did was this. He used the military to stop the bad guys. But the military was not needed to do the good things because Kuwait, not any society that met a lot of our values, but Kuwait was a functioning society. All that needed to be done was to drive out Saddam Hussein and leave Kuwait to govern itself. But we have not done that in other places. The second mistake I made was to be supportive of the effort to overthrow Gaddafi. Again, a bad guy, and a situation in which the average Libyan was much better off when he was in power. That does not mean that we should take the role of enforcing their rule, what we did in Iran years ago, terrible. But we don't have to get involved in everything. And this happened in Iraq. Look, it happened in another case that we used to be proud of. I mentioned Sudan. We intervened to force the government of Sudan to give autonomy, not independence, to the section known as South Sudan. There was an ethnic split there. The north is more Arab, the south black, Muslim, animist, and Christian. South Sudan got independence in part because of our pressure. Sadly, it has been a hellhole ever since, with massive abuses. Again, I'm not saying we should have intervened to keep it that way, but we should be much less sure that intervening to dissolve an authoritarian regime is going to lead to a better life for people. And we should also understand it doesn't hurt us. The fact is that, again, where we can be helpful, where we can intervene, yeah, I think that is a good thing. I think Bill Clinton is right to say we should have done more to stop the massacre in Central Africa, Rwanda, and Burundi. But here's the problem, and this is done by the Bush administration and Cheney. So he said, we can't accomplish it, we have no self-interest in doing it, and most of all, we can't afford it. If we were to scale back the military to what we need to protect our own interests and to be available to help countries that were being unduly mistreated by an outsider. Yeah, I was glad we were able to repel Saddam from Kuwait. I don't think Israel hasn't asked for our aid. I would not want to see Iran invade Israel and us not do anything about it. There are other places where we can do something, but they are very limited. And if we were to scale back what we need for self-defense and a reasonable capacity to help others who are threatened, we could save well over $100 billion a year. Putin, bad guy. It's not the Soviet Union. I'm glad that my grandparents got the hell out of there. But the fact is, and here's the difference, Putin is not the existential threat to us that Stalin was. Here's the deal. From before 1940, America did not do much militarily. Intervened in World War I, came back. And then beginning in 1940, there was a 50-year period where there were existential threats to our existence as a free society. Really bad people, Hitler, Stalin, Stalin's successors. They did terrible things to people, the invasion of Hungary, etc. And they were heavily armed. So we had to arm ourselves to be able to defend them. I think towards the end we overdid that, but there was still a justification for it. And then beginning in 1990, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was the last time America as a country was threatened by an outside force. And so George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton began to reduce military spending. I have an article, a letter I quote in the book I wrote from John McCain saying, let's give ourselves a peace dividend. And the military was going down in spending. We weren't helpless. Bill Clinton was able to use the Air Force, and I thought constructively with some debate to make it better in South Yugoslavia. It's not perfect there, but I think people have been able to do better. But what happens is this. The military spending is going down. There is a group of Americans called the neoconservatives who disagree that the purpose of our military is to defend ourselves and protect ourselves and maybe some vulnerable allies. These are people whose view it is that America's role in the world requires us to be the enforcer of order in the world. Not freedom, not democracy, order. These are people who believe, and they will say, it is not worthy of a great nation just to be worried about the quality of life and how much money they have. In some cases, they say it is our God-given mission, you've seen this, to enforce order in the world. Well, apparently our God-given mission, it started around, 1940. I don't know who God had put in charge of that before us, but it is a moral imperative that we intervene where there are problems to bring order to the world. Now, they try in some cases, because they know most people aren't going to buy that without some argument of self-interest. And they say, well, but it's in America's self-interest. One you may have read is, we have to have a very large Navy to keep open the sea lanes. Well, and they talk about the Straits of Malacca near Malaysia, which are it's the route that Chinese ships take to get to America. Now, the only power that could shut those down would be China. What happens over those sea lanes? Chinese ships bring to America goods from which they make hundreds of billions of dollars a year in profit. Why in the world do we have to worry about the Chinese shutting down the most profitable source of dollars? And why is it only America? So they try to hoke up these self-interested reasons. And they're just not true. What they really are motivated by is this view that it is America's mission to bring order in the world. And I'm not making this up. You can look up, there are books in which they say it. Henry Kissinger's new book, World Order. It's up to America to preserve the world order. And knowing that this is a problem, as I said, they try to produce kind of self-interested economic reasons. They don't work. But they caught a break in 2001. And I don't mean for a second that they were happy about it or that they conspired to it. It was a terrible thing, but they thought, okay, maybe we can make something out of this. When we were attacked by Osama bin Laden, the Cheney group, and it included Paul Wolfowitz, who worked with him, and I don't know how many people hanging over at the Hoover Institution. I'm sure if you went over there, you'd find an archive about it, and there were a lot of them who think that was a good idea. They succeeded in blowing up the threat from terrorism. There was a threat from terrorism. It was that some Americans would be killed, and that's a bad thing. But there was never anything remotely approaching the threat from Stalin and Hitler and Khrushchev and Andropov and others to destroy America. But they managed to inflate America's fears so that they were then able to pump military spending back up. Go look at military spending. It goes down, and now it's going back up again. And unfortunately, President Obama has not been able to resist. There is something about becoming president, having people tell you you're the leader of the free world. We're the leader of the free world with our allies like Saudi Arabia and other bastions of freedom. And he is now going to ask Congress for $8 billion to increase American troops in Europe because they're worried about Putin. Well, if the Europeans are worried about Putin, between us and NATO, this is for NATO. Well, NATO includes Germany, England, France, Italy, Denmark, Belgium, a lot of other countries that could do it because they don't do it. The notion is America has to do it. And it's just crazy. We are spending, by the way, what happens is our military spending is additive. We have geared up to fight the terrorists and to fight Putin and to fight China in the South China Sea, but we haven't given up fighting the Soviet Union. During the height of the Cold War, we developed what was called the Triad, 3 ways of dropping thermonuclear weapons on the Soviet Union. They had some reciprocal ones. They were intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Strategic Air Command by air, and nuclear submarines. We still have 3 ways of dropping thermonuclear weapons on the Soviet Union, which is not anything like what it used to be, Russia. I mean, by the way, much of the nuclear capacity was in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, given away. There was no need for us to maintain that triad. The president, to get a nuclear treaty with Russia, ratified in the Senate in 2012, agreed to spend literally billions more on building up our intercontinental ballistic missile system. I have proposed to the Pentagon, seriously, although people may think I'm kidding, we have 3 ways of waging a thermonuclear war on the greatly diminished Soviet Union. Pick 2. Keep 2 ways of destroying them. Probably it would be the airplanes and the submarines because they have other uses. There is no military rationale for intercontinental ballistic missiles. I don't know if you heard there was a great scandal because the guys who were there were just busy playing cards and not getting anything done. We could save that. We do not have, again, talk about the Air Force. There's an article in 2012 in the Wall Street Journal the day after the election. I'm a big gloater, as I've told you. So when an election goes well for me, I like to read the Wall Street Journal and see how miserable they are. And there was an article by a guy who'd been the Secretary of the Air Force under George W. and another Air Force guy. He said, we are worried about the Air Force. It is true that no American has been killed by hostile enemy aircraft since 1953. It's 2012. And it is also true that American air power has dominated the battlefield every place since then. And because of that, they say, unfortunately, some people don't realize that we need to greatly expand the Air Force. Yeah, I was one of them. Quick question. China may be altering this some, but by far, of course, the most powerful Air Force in the world is the U.S. Air Force. People here know what is the second most powerful Air Force in the world after the U.S. Air Force? It's the U.S. Navy. They have a separate Air Force. On the assumption that they will not soon go to war with each other, we can probably diminish one or the other. The Chinese are building up. They got an aircraft carrier. Now, they're working on a second. But until now, the Chinese have one aircraft carrier. It is a recommissioned surplus Ukrainian ship. And for a couple of years, you couldn't land planes on it, so they stationed it next to a fairly flat cliff so the planes could simulate. It's a true story. We could substantially reduce our military expenditures by well over $100 billion a year. And by the way, people, what about jobs here? Well, you know what? We got weapons that we don't need. We're already building them. Keep building them. Don't build any new ones. Pull back on our international thing. I want to keep troops in South Korea. They are threatened by a nuclear-armed lunatic, and that's an area where we should do some good. Japan can help itself. In fact, I have a conciliatory statement to make. I believe it is time for us fully to forgive Japan and Germany for what they did 75 years ago, because we have punished them over the last 75 years by essentially restraining them from spending enough to defend themselves. And instead, our punishment has been that we defend them. And I am ready to say, okay, you can come out of your room now. You can, if you feel threatened, you spend. By the way, if we told Europe that they should spend for their own defense, it wouldn't mean they'd spend a lot of money because they don't really feel threatened. As long as we'll do it for free, they'll accept it. But that's overall, I'm going to bring this to a close. If we were to stop prosecuting people for drugs with all that cost, and even more, scale back the military, and we'll still have the strongest military in the world. And that, to some of my friends on the left, sounds xenophobic, but it's just a factual statement. Factually, some nation is going to be the strongest in the world militarily. When you look at the potential candidates, I would like it to be America. If Denmark could be the strongest nation in the world, or Costa Rica, it would not trouble me, but they're not in the league. But we could be the strongest nation in the world, well able to defend any of our legitimate interests for much less. Now, what's happened is this, and I'll close. Cheney and his allies succeeded in persuading President Bush and others that this was an equivalent threat. They overreached. Finally, even President Bush in his last term pushed Cheney aside. And we were beginning to scale back. And then came ISIS. Terrible people, and among the things ISIS has done is to scare Americans again. But I'm hoping people do understand we don't need it, and the Republicans understand that. There was a great deal of Republican criticism of President Obama for not going back into the Middle East on the ground. But they have refused to do this legislatively. Interestingly, for all their complaints that the president acts too much unilaterally and everything else, They want him to make war unilaterally. They refuse to authorize it. And to his credit, he has said, no, I need you to tell me this. He's unfairly criticized because he didn't bomb Syria when he said he would, because he has Congress for the authorization, and they refused to give it to him. And he should be praised for saying, no, the war-making power is not a unilateral executive power. But the Republicans have a dual track. They attack Barack Obama for not sending troops back into the Middle East in various places, sure, Iraq, maybe Syria. And at the same time, they refuse to put it to a vote because their own members are saying to the leadership, I don't want to vote on that. That's not popular. So I'm optimistic. I think the American people has now gotten over the excessive fears of 9/11 and even of the Islamic State. And the president is right to talk about how, no, they are not an existential threat to America. They are people we should oppose. But, you know, I wish nuclear submarines would defeat terrorists because they don't have any. And we have a lot, and it would be over. We are spending a lot of money on weapons that are totally irrelevant to this fight, not to mention what we spend on Homeland Security. So, bottom line, yeah, we are troubled now by an excessive anger that is expressed irrationally. I believe it can be alleviated, because we know the causes, if we were to reinvigorate our capacity to act together, to provide programmatic help, to reduce the negative effects of inequality, and to turn inequality around, and to do the things that will help those Americans who are feeling justifiably angry that they haven't participated in the prosperity to do so. And we could do it if we would have rational policies on substances, and if we were to begin now the substantial reduction in the military, which George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton had begun, and which was interrupted by 9/11, understandably but inaccurately. And so I hope, let me close, and I appreciated what Barbara said about having been represented by me. I have to tell you, you are extremely well represented, if you, I'm sure, already know it, by Anna Eshoo, who is an excellent member. And, but, you know, even your, well, Barbara's leaving, and she knew this. I'm a great admirer of Dianne Feinstein. Dianne was enormously courageous in standing up to the CIA and getting published that report about torture. But it wouldn't hurt to tell her that we could spend some less on the military and not be invaded. And I hope even among you have a lot of, here in the Bay Area, it's a pretty liberal group of people. Not everybody needs to know it. I was with Barbara Lee this morning, and Barbara knows this. But if you were to write to your representative and senators and say, you know what, we will feel very safe at a military spending level in America, which is about what? Twice what everybody else in the world does rather than 3 times. That's the best thing you can do. And no other issue helps. If we are not able substantially to reduce military spending, forget about improving the spending on education or housing or environmental protection or transportation or medical research or anything else. The military is eating everybody else's lunch unnecessarily. So I hope that people here will act on that. And you've got people who are ready to believe this. Empower your elected officials to stand up to the fearmongers, and we'll all be better off. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Frank. What we're going to do is I will ask a few questions, get the discussion going, and then we're going to open up the mics. We request that you form a line behind the mics as you have a question, and that you keep your questions short, not give us long speeches. And we will recognize as many as we can. We'll finish sometime between 7 and 7:30. We need to allow time for the signing of the books. Plus, it's a long time to be talking. So, Congressman Frank, the first part of your talk kind of doesn't paint a rosy picture for realizing the second part of your talk, right? I mean, the first part of your talk is we've got this political system with intense preferences, a primary system that scares a lot of Republicans into, you know, hoping yes, but voting no, or vice versa. You've got a lot of pressures on these people, these electoral pressures you're talking about. And what you've proposed is, I'm sure for a lot of people in the audience, a good direction to go in, but how do you get there when the Republican Party has always defended military expenditures, is taking a very, very hard line in this election about the Middle East? So how do we get to
All right, fair
this
point.
vision?
I'd say a couple of things. First of all, you concede for now that advocating the higher spending that is morally and economically justified in other programs isn't going to go anywhere, and you put it aside. Secondly, though, here's the optimistic part. I believe that the American public is not in favor of going back in militarily. And I think it is a case where a lot of people think that, but they don't realize other people think it. And that's why I think if people were to start empowering their elected officials to say no, that would work. So you begin not by spending more where I would like to, but by spending less. You know, there are some elements of this, and I would say this, the Republican leadership understands it. They are talking about sending troops in, but they refuse to have a vote on it. Mitch McConnell is not going to let people vote on it. Why? Because he's worried about losing the majority in the Senate. And he's got Republican senators. Part of the role of leadership, I'm doing this in my course on legislating, when you're a legislative leader, part of your job is to protect the members from having to take tough votes. So they can go out and tell people how much they want to do things and then tell you, please don't let that come up so I can advocate it without having to vote for it. And I think we work on that and call them on that and say, okay, how come you're not doing it? So I am optimistic in that sense. I'm sorry Rand Paul didn't do a little better because he was doing that. But even they talk tough, but Lindsey Graham wanted to send in ground troops. I know Lindsey, he's a good guy. I have never met a part of the world where he would not invade. But
Including California, or?
yeah, especially California. But that's, I mean, on the whole, am I optimistic? No, but there's no other, compared to what? What else can we do? I do believe if people were to speak out and say, cut back, start by supporting Obama, tell Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, resist the ground troops, stand up to them, and I think what will happen, it will be popular. And I must say, I'm optimistic in this sense. I don't know who wins the Republican nomination. Rubio appeared to be doing well until he had this brain freeze, which, if it is either Trump or Cruz, the Democrats win big. And we need to be willing to build on that. But I guess I would just say I'm optimistic because I think there is more public support for pulling back than we thought. A couple of things. I think people ought to rally and say, why are we sending money to defend Western Europe? What happened to Europe? Why are we subsidizing them? I do think, again, it's the more negative side of it. Overwhelming, you begin lobbying for cutting back militarily, staying out of the Middle East, and that I think could succeed.
Now, of course, Obama tried to do that in Syria, but now we've got the situation with the refugee crisis. What's the answer to that? They're pouring over the borders in Europe. To leave them in the country is to get them slaughtered. I mean, it seems
it's
like
a very
an
tough
impossible
one.
choice.
Part of it is, I wish I would get better, is to pay a lot of money to Turkey and Jordan to keep them there. I mean, just to make their lives better in Turkey and Jordan, and for America to contribute financially to ease the problem in Greece and elsewhere. It's not easily solvable, but the notion that we will solve it by overthrowing Assad just isn't going to happen. We haven't got the capacity. So I would say this is one where we use money, that we massively step up and say we will help. Now they'll be running some political resistance. But the Europeans talked about giving the money to Turkey, and then they get into their own dispute about that. Pay Turkey, pay Jordan, and pay Greece.
Of course, that's money that's going to foreign policy.
I agree.
Domestic policy.
I agree, and that could be a hard one. I guess the way to do it would be this. You could do a little razzle-dazzle. You sort of maybe pass it through the Europeans and encourage the Europeans to do more of it.
So if you take the Frank view, it seems like the two Democratic candidates for the presidency kind of have pluses and minuses for both of you, because in some sense, Frank gives you, I'm sorry, Sanders gives you a closer position to sort of a military,
Right.
a less militaristic a position than Hillary. But on domestic policy, he seems, if I can read between the lines of your remarks, to be into more simplistic notions of how to handle the financial situation.
First of all, I do not think he can win. He looks good now because the Republicans love him, and they really are urgently looking for him to win the nomination. But once you start, and it's not negative. Let me start with this. If I thought you could be positioned where Sanders is ideologically and have some of his personal and ethnic and chronological characteristics and be elected president, I might have run. Although I do think, I love Jim. He might have been a little bit hard to sell as first man, my husband. But first of all, on Hillary Clinton, yeah, she was good. Look, during her husband's presidency, they were very good in cutting the military. There was, however, this view that developed during the Cold War period that the major obstacle to a Democrat winning the presidency would be this notion that he or she wasn't tough enough on national security. Now, Bill Clinton was a happy exception for that because he got elected in the afterglow of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But if you notice, in 2003, when Congress voted on invading Iraq, every senator who wanted to be president, which at any given time is a statistically significant percentage of the Senate. You get elected to the Senate, you think you're going to be president. It used to be white guys, now black people, women, anybody gets elected to the Senate thinks they could get elected. Still straight people, but that may even change. Joe Biden voted for the war. John Kerry voted. Look at John Kerry. John Kerry voted against the invasion of Kuwait to kick Saddam out, which I also voted with him on, but now looks more sensible. I mean, how do you justify voting not to let Bush drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and then vote to try to drive him out of Iraq? Really kind of a hard thing to sell. Joe Biden voted for it. I mean, Obama's lucky he wasn't in the Senate, so he didn't have to vote on it. Other than that, since then, Hillary Clinton is much closer to my position. I don't think a no-fly zone is that kind of problem. She has been much more reasonable on it. And I think she will be moving further in that direction. And let me say, I know people say, well, she's moved her position some. Of course, so has Bernie Sanders on gun control. And I can say this notion that if a politician begins to move, you should be very upset about it. After all, part of the purpose of political organizing is to move them. And by the way, I don't think it hurts you. I know people get accused of flip-flopping. I will tell you this, based on very strong evidence. Almost nobody objects to someone changing his position if they are changing it to agree with them. People are much more tolerant of flip-flops that come to them. Corollary, by the way, which is if you take a position people don't like, as you explain your position, you may make them angrier. I once told John Kerry, when he asked me how he should justify in 2004 being against same-sex marriage, I said, don't justify it. Just say, look, that's my position. Because the more you explain it to us, the angrier people are going to get. So he said, okay, but how do I explain my position to the people who agree with me, who are against same-sex marriage? And I don't know about you, I have never met anybody who demanded I explain to them why I agreed with them. So you just don't have to do it. But I think they will both be on the same side. In fact, I have this problem with Bernie. He is one of those I'm talking about who denounces government. You listen to, and here's one of my problems with Sanders. Did someone forfeit the right to be called progressive who supports the affordable health care approach rather than single payer? Who takes money from PACs and has a super PAC? Who takes contributions from the financial industry? Who's opposed to reinstating Glass-Steagall? I just described Barack Obama. not Hillary Clinton. And my problem with my former colleague Bernie is he is too negative about what we can do. I agree with him, it would be nice if we could do more. But it is self-defeating to give people the impression that until we can do more, it's not worth doing what we can. Because that, I think, reinforces the non-participation. So I think you have to not demonize government. Demonize the people who are against the government doing things. Stress the failures, the mistakes of public policy. But when you say, and here's a disagreement I have with Krugman, very thoughtfully laid this out, when you tell people that nothing they say matters because big money dominates everything, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in fact, it isn't true. People here will be familiar with an experience that shows that. About a year ago, all of the providers of entertainment content here, Hollywood, they wanted to pass a bill that would make it harder for teenagers to listen to other people's work for free, which will give you my bias. I am not persuaded that it is a fundamental right that other people make music and you should be able to listen to it for free. But I recognize that it's not a popular view among the younger people that want to listen to it. But here's what happens. All of the powerful interests in America get behind a bill, the Motion Picture Association, the recording industry, and others, that will clamp down on free stuff on the internet. And then Google and others pass the word, hey, they got a bill that's going to make it harder for you to download this and that. And the public arises in great anger, and they all email their members of Congress, and that bill disappears. It turns out it was, nobody knows who sponsored it because nobody would claim it. I mean, money is very important as long as the votes are silent. But votes mobilize, and they will get the job done. And I think my problem with Bernie Sanders is, I just felt in political, I'd like to do a lot of what he'd like to do. He acknowledges that the only way to do it is to have a revolution. By the way, he was in the Senate in the Congress for 25 years. You know, if it was easy to do, he might have been able to do something. He said, we have to have a revolution. Well, I would like to have that revolution, political participation. It seems to me unlikely to happen in the near term. And here is the problem. If you denigrate what's been done and say that doesn't count and it won't do any good until we get a revolution, you make that revolution unlikely.
Well, let's pick up on that theme because the other thing that he wants to do is break up the banks, and what's an implicit criticism of Dodd-Frank, I think. So, or maybe an explicit.
Which he voted for.
Which, okay.
You know, Bernie Sanders has been in Congress for 25 years. Contrary to the impression that I think some people have that he spent the time on Mars. I mean, he was a member of Congress. By the way, no, it's not, yes, it is critical of Barack Obama. Again, there is the only criticism he levels against Hillary Clinton that did not apply to Barack Obama was voting for the war in Iraq. On the other hand, Bernie, when he was in Congress, as I did, because we weren't paying attention, voted to deregulate derivatives in 2000, as Hillary has mentioned. Yeah, by the way, and I think she has a better part of that argument. What he wants to do is to reduce the size of the banks, although I will tell you, I don't know to what size he wants to reduce them. If you enacted Glass-Steagall and you required J.P. Morgan Chase and Citicorp to divest their securities industries, you would still have humongous banks left. You would have, in fact, instead of having one bank that was too big to fail, in his terms, I think we've resolved that, you'd have two. You wouldn't affect Goldman Sachs, they're not covered. What Hillary Clinton is advocating is to use the powers we put into the bill to break them up piece by piece, bank by bank, not one size fits all. And one of Sanders, I was arguing, debating with Sanders person the other night, I said, well, how come Hillary Clinton hasn't used those powers yet? Well, she's a private citizen, and she was the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State does not administer the banking laws. I mean, literally, if you look at you look at Bernie Sanders' criticism on everything except the Iraq War, he's aiming directly at Barack Obama. And that troubles me for a couple of reasons. First of all, Barack Obama wins in 2008. We had won 2 congressional elections in a row. Thanks to the separation of powers, you really need to win at least 2 elections in a row to have that power. We win 2 elections in a row. We have, under Barack Obama, the Democrats were in a better position than at any time since 1964, when we benefited from Lyndon Johnson. And with all of that, with all the forces against us, we were able to get what we were able to get in both healthcare and financial reform with no votes to spare. And I think the notion that we could have done a lot better and also that having done that wasn't wasn't worth it. First of all, Sanders voted for both of those, and I don't know. Go back last year, the students here, you want to do a good paper, if anybody else wants to do it, go back and check how vigorous was Bernie Sanders in denouncing that. Not terribly. He was for the Glass-Steagall. It lost because he knew what we got was better than we could get. So I think he's just wrong subject on Glass-Steagall. But whether he is or isn't, the fact is that we got as far as we could in 2008. Let me put it this way. In our most optimistic, I think Bernie gets the nomination. The most optimistic projections are that we might take the House back by 5 votes, not 45. We might get, 52 votes or 3 in the Senate, not 59. The notion that he will win an election and have a mandate to do significantly more than we did this last time is not good. And what I am afraid is building people up so that you have a letdown.
So in a minute, people should come to the mics. I'll ask one last question, and then we'll go to the audience. So you mentioned, and I think it was a very good point, that there's anger emanating from the working class that feels like they've been left behind by changes in the economy and various other things. Do you think the Democratic Party's made a mistake by being as free trade oriented as it has
Yes.
with NAFTA and TPP? And then
Yes.
if you're going to compensate them, you can't just give them money. You got to find some place in the economy.
No,
What would
I
that place
agree.
be?
I'm disappointed in President Obama. On this one, by the way, Hillary Clinton is better than Obama because she has moved, and a lot of other people have as well. Free trade was the mantra of liberals, and finally now people understand. No, and Paul Krugman is another good example, a great economist, and now acknowledges free trade improves the overall economic pie, but does it in an unfair way. And what I think, and you tell that to President Obama, he said, well, I'm for a lot of measures that will alleviate that. But my answer to him was, we did an open letter and printed the Boston Globe. Yeah, but the people whose votes you need to do the good things are blocking you, and they want you to do trade. So you got to tell them, yes, I will implement a trade bill after you have restored the power of unions and raised the minimum wage and done some other very useful things. And that includes not just retraining people. A 58-year-old guy, he's not going to be easily retrained. You have public programs that put them to work. There's plenty of that we can do through public sector work. So yes, and I think that most of the Democratic Party has repudiated that. President Obama, I think, is sort of left alone in that. The other thing is, it's a little more controversial. I believe we have been a little bit too insensitive to people's legitimate economic needs. I alluded to this in the environmental area. And here's the deal. You don't compromise on clean air. You don't compromise on climate change. But endangered species, a couple other things, instead of giving wetlands, instead of giving a veto in some of these areas, I think you have to be a little bit more sensitive to what happens. I would have a hierarchy of environmental value. Yes, clean air, clean water, climate change, untouchable. Preserving a battlefield, I got to tell you, maybe it's a defect in me. The notion that because something interesting happened in a place hundreds of years ago means that is forever valuable escapes me. But when you say you're going to shut down work because of that, that's the thing. I represented 2 cities in southeastern Massachusetts, Fall River, New Bedford. They were textile cities and garment cities, and almost everything is left. Not everything. I am wearing a union-made suit manufactured by the Joseph Abboud Company in New Bedford, Massachusetts. You want to buy a union-made suit in America, guys, go get a Joseph Abboud suit. They get them at the Men's Warehouse. But there's not a lot of work there. There's work in Boston. So we want to build commuter rail from Fall River, New Bedford up to Boston. I got environmentalists telling me that we can't do that because it will disarrange the Hockomock Swamp. And by the way, I think they're even wrong environmentally because we want to get a lot of cars off the road. So there's a problem there as well.
Okay, so we're going to go to the questions. Remember the rules. Keep it short. Otherwise, I will cut you off. Okay, to the left.
Okay, so one of those no question issues is global climate change, and yet it's something where the political will and the engagement of Congress has been extremely low in terms of taking action. One solution is to put a price on carbon and then to rebate that those fees back to the American people. And it's a solution that appeals to many Republicans because it's a market signal instead of government regulation. It doesn't increase tax, and it actually stimulates the economy by making high carbon users pay for what they use and rebating money to the economy. And I wonder what you think about that and other solutions to global
Well,
climate change.
President Obama tried to do some of that. The House actually passed some version of it. Two things I would say to you. The Republicans to whom this appeals, to whom you allude, none of them are in Congress. None of them are in elected office. It's an effective economic market solution, but it's complicated by what I talked about. For that to work, you have to trust government's competence. You have to take the step of providing more revenue to the government with the understanding that they will fix it. I'm for that. We are not in a position now where we have that. And you also have, look, there's a preliminary problem there. It has now become more popular in the Republican Party than not to deny that climate change is an issue. And that's, again, part of this anger. So the answer is, now, I do think this. You got a Democratic president, House, and Senate, you probably could get that done. But that's the problem.
Okay, let's go over here.
You mentioned one source of anger of the American public, but I've heard another about immigration. How would you address that?
I don't think that's nearly as bad. First of all, of course, immigration to some extent is a job problem, but Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, both pretty sensitive to politics. Neither one of them has backed off. I do not think that and in fact, immigration, it is only recently that got stoked. And let me go a further point. What Trump has successfully done with Cruz's help is to agglomerate immigration and terrorism, wholly illogically. He's worried about immigration from Mexico. He says he's going to shut down immigration from Mexico to stop terrorism. That's not where it comes from. I do believe, to the extent that you can talk about what we're going to do to fight terrorism, well, let me put it this way. The only time I saw great popularity behind an anti-immigrant position was when the president proposed letting Syrians come into America, and a number of governors said no. But that was the fear of terrorism, not immigration. And this notion of keeping out all the Hispanics, et cetera, that one does not hurt us politically. The sentiment there is about terrorism, and the way to deal with it is to try to keep those separate and then focus on what you do about terrorism.
Okay, let's go back to the left.
I'd like to ask a question that tries to connect your suggestion that we get involved and write our congressman, tell Dianne Feinstein not to support the military, and a generic notion of militarism. I can't see how, if I write Dianne Feinstein or even Anna Eshoo, with Lockheed Martin down the road providing all the kinds of jobs it does, for them to change their vote. And that gets us back to the problem of the influence of money on politics. And it's not just lobby groups, it's things like Lockheed Martin and a whole militarism. And this is also reflected in your response to the idea that you would have changed your vote on the first war in Iraq and Kuwait. As you well know, there was an Arab peace plan that the Bush administration insisted that was not even on the table, and that kind of thing could be,
All right, I disagree with you on that. There was no Arab peace plan that was going to get Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait. He cared as much about that Arab peace plan, as a dog does about Shakespeare. This is a brutal thug, and no Arab peace plan. And by the way, no Arab peace plan in the history of the world has ever done anything to anybody because there's almost too much division. So, and I think, in fact, invading, what George Bush did in there was to drive Saddam Hussein out, restore Kuwait. I didn't see any downside to that. On the other hand, though, two things. First of all, the reason that Dianne Feinstein and Anna Eshoo, this is a liberal mistake, the reason they vote to keep Lockheed Martin is not contributions from Lockheed Martin. It is the people who work for Lockheed Martin and vote. The power, and I don't deny that it's there, but please don't, if there were no campaign contributions, you would still have members not ready to vote to shut down jobs for people in their district. So that's why I said, and I should have been clearer, and I acknowledge I wasn't. I would not urge them to vote to shut down any existing weapons system. But there's a basic principle you know this about your kids. Jeremy Bentham justified not making utilitarianism total equality on this principle. It is a lot easier to deny people something in the first place than to take it away from them once they have it. So what you write to Diane to do is say, please don't vote for any new weapon systems. Don't tell her to try to vote against Lockheed. And not just that. Yes, there is some money from America. You know how much money America gets from the troops in Europe? Nothing. So be selective. Don't. Yes, I agree with you. Urging members of Congress to vote against money that is now being spent to hire people in their districts, and it is the employment pattern. Because if you correlate this, what you'll see is this. The people who tend to vote weapon systems, it's based on the weapon systems being built in their district. Well, if it was campaign contributions, you wouldn't have that correlation. They can send the money anywhere. It's the votes, and I agree with you, that's the problem. There are plenty of ways to cut spending. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, we're not making that many anymore. You could ask her to cut those. So I would concede that there are weapon systems that are being built that shouldn't be built, but there is plenty of room for savings other than that, especially if you say, okay, we understand that's going. Don't vote for any new ones. And don't vote to send troops here. And don't vote to keep to send $8 billion more to Europe. I guarantee you nobody in Diane's district, nobody in the state of California, not a district, is going to have a vested interest in sending $8 billion to Europe.
Okay, we got 3 questions more, and that actually will work out nicely. We should end around 7:15 so you can sign some books. Yeah.
Jack Morgan, in September of 1914, wrote a letter to President Wilson, who was elected to keep us out of the war, saying, "This war will be a great opportunity for America." Was he correct?
No, you're talking about J.P. Morgan. You said
Yes,
Jack Morgan. Not all of us are as familiar
Morgan
with
wrote
him.
a letter.
It was J.P. Morgan.
I read this in Nomi
I'm not
Prince.
challenging you, just to help people understand
She
that
said
when you say Jack Morgan,
she
people
said-
might not understood it was J.P. Morgan.
She said Jack Morgan, the banker, wrote a letter in September
Okay.
of
That's
1914.
think we
J.P.
got the
That's J.P.
question.
Morgan.
Yeah.
I really thought about that, and I don't rush to things. No, it wasn't a great opportunity. America didn't benefit from it. The Treaty of Versailles was badly done. It was excessively harsh. It was one of the first times John Maynard Keynes was right about things. He was very critical of that treaty. I think humanity was better off with the Kaiser losing. But no, it was not a great opportunity for America. We did not benefit. By the way, in fact, we went from that war with a fairly short period into a depression. If you're looking at what did America benefit from, America benefited from World War II, a terrible, awful thing. Nobody with a shred of decency could be happy. But America did not benefit from World War I the way it benefited from World War II. America benefited from World War II because everybody else got clobbered. I don't think that, I don't know whether Morgan made money off of financing the war or what. But no, I think he was wrong about that.
Okay, I see a couple more people have snuck in. So here what we're going to do. We'll do these 2 questions, and then I'll combine the last 2 so that there'll be 2. All right, so go ahead on the left here.
Can you tell me why a liberal state such as California did not vote to allow the legal use of recreational marijuana?
Yeah, I can't tell you why I wasn't here. I was disappointed. And Jerry Brown has been, I got to say, I'm a great admirer of Jerry Brown. In spite of everything I said, having gotten this state to vote for higher taxes is one of the most significant, positive, liberal accomplishments in recent times. And I admire him for that. But I don't know what his problem was on marijuana. Part of it is, look, it's what H.L. Mencken said, Puritanism, the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be having a good time. There is and I can't psychoanalyze Jerry. I've known him. He may have been sort of overreacting against the view that he was too, his prior reputation as being someone a little too countercultural. I think it's going to be coming. I will give you the analogy. Legalization of marijuana, the analogy is to same-sex marriage, which we now have. Here's what you have. And I filed a bill to legalize marijuana in 1972. And I read the Nixon report. Nixon did a report at the time to try and say it shouldn't be good, because you always want to know what your opponents think. And I was very happy on reading it to see what their argument was. They could not say that ingesting marijuana made you behave badly or had bad health effects. They said if people smoke marijuana, it would be bad for the economy because it would depress the work ethic. Essentially, that people smoking marijuana would be much too mellow to be productive economic citizens. You go look it up. And I said, okay, now I can not worry about this. Here's the situation with same-sex marriage and marijuana. You have an activity that some people enjoy, marrying someone of the same sex or smoke marijuana. Other people disapprove of it on some moral ground. They think it's wrong. But they understand that in America, there's enough of a libertarian strain. You can't win an argument just by saying, I don't want you to do that. I don't like it. So they have to then manufacture adverse social consequences. To win the argument against it, you have to show how it will have negative consequences. So you argue that you have same-sex marriage, it will disturb heterosexual marriages. I will tell you that I've spent 20 years. Nobody's ever explained that. In 1996, on the floor of the House, debating the Defense of Marriage Act, they said, explain to me, I marry a guy. How is that hurting your marriage? I'm begging you, tell me, what is the connection? How do I hurt your marriage if I marry somebody else? A guy named Steve Largent from Oklahoma got up. And he said, you could ask Mickey Edwards about him because Mickey's from Oklahoma. He said, well, he asked me to yield. I yielded. He said, let me say to the gentleman that it's true that same-sex marriage wouldn't hurt my marriage. And it wouldn't hurt the marriage of anybody else in the house. But it would hurt the institution of marriage. My response was to take back my time, as you can do, and say, Mr. Speaker, it's not going to hurt his marriage. It's not going to hurt anybody else's marriage. It's not going to hurt any real marriage. It's going to hurt the institution of marriage. That is an argument that sounds like it was made by somebody in an institution. And what happened was this. But like with government, vicious cycles are a problem. We were in a vicious cycle because a lot of people believe responsible people said would have negative social consequences. And as long as they believed it had no negative social consequences, we couldn't win it. And until we could win it and make it a reality, we could not prove that it did not have negative social consequences. Another vicious cycle. And then in 2003, an extraordinarily able woman named Margaret Marshall, a South African immigrant to America, Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, gets 4 to 3 vote in favor of same-sex marriage. And we get same-sex marriage. And then 1 or 2 other states do it. By 2006 and 7, it is now clear that none of these negative consequences have happened. That was the beachhead. And you could, people wrote all these articles about divorce rates and everything else. And so, as it mushroomed, by the time 8 years later it became a national issue, 2012, 9 years later, when we won all the referenda. It's true we ultimately won at the Supreme Court, and I'm glad we did, but we would have won it in most states. I'd put it this way. Almost every state where anybody would want to marry somebody of the same sex and live would have voted for it. But what happened was we won the argument because they had based their case on non-existent negative consequences. That's where we are with marijuana. It has always been clear that people smoking marijuana is of no concern to anybody else. But we couldn't prove that. And then came Colorado. First of all, we had medical marijuana, and that helped because people would say, oh, that medical marijuana, that's just a dodge. That's just to let people smoke marijuana anyway. And my answer to that was, yeah. and they undercut their own argument because as they successfully argued that allowing medical marijuana was really just a thinly veiled proxy for smoking marijuana, we could then prove the absence of negative consequences. But then came Colorado and Washington. I was at a meeting in Portland, Oregon yesterday with a very good congressman, Earl Blumenauer, and one of the events was a meeting of hundreds of people from the cannabis industry. And that one's coming, but they're very similar. People say they're no good, and then a breakthrough happens, And it is now very clear there have been no negative consequences from people smoking marijuana. No automobile accidents, no kids being, et cetera, no negative health consequences. So I believe that even Jerry Brown's going to have to come around, and within a few years, I predict you will have a fairly widespread usage.
Jerry Brown smoking pot, that mind boggles. Okay.
I have a response to those of my friends who tell me that having people marry of the same sex is really, really not patriotic, not moral, not. And I always tell them, well, your path is set then. You have a patriotic duty not to marry one. I have a question about what could be a looming social problem, possibly a repeat of our homeless problem insofar as it is the grandchild of the release of people from mental institutions in California when there was no place to receive them out
And not
in the
just in
world.
California. You're absolutely right. It was a national problem.
It was. And I see now that we have people talking about compassionate release for sick and elderly prisoners from our prisons. We also have thoughts about diminishing the cost of prisons by letting go a lot of the nonviolent sort of personal offenses for using drugs and possessing drugs. And I'm wondering, what can we do to provide a crash pad for such people if they
Very
get
good,
turned
very good
out?
question. Twofold. Yes, we made a great mistake. By the way, I was a critic of the pace of deinstitutionalization, and it should not have been beyond our capacity to have some of those institutions be humane, and there were people who I believe were not capable of functioning well on their own and should have been given the option of well-run institutions. Secondly, and let me divide your question, with regard to the elderly and the infirm, yeah, there need to be places they can go. You can't turn an 82-year-old out of prison. And so yes, then they
$50
should
and
be
a Greyhound ticket.
maintained. We should build some facilities. And in fact, do the accounting right. Figure out how much you're saving by letting them out and using some of those savings to house them humanely. With regard to the others, I am less worried. Remember, when you were talking about people who are either emotionally troubled or mentally ill, or the elderly, they can't function on their own. I believe the great majority of people we are talking about in the drug cases, they're not dysfunctional people. There will be some transitional issues, but that's part of a general sense. I just believe we ought to have, I'm all in favor of work requirements for any form of benefit as long as we provide the work. People want to do the one without the other. So I think that latter one can be more easily done, particularly if it's at a time that you can find employment for people. That is, I do not think they need the institutional help that either the mentally ill or the elderly do. But you do have to be careful about jobs.
Okay, we're running short on time, so we're going to combine the two questions. You can both ask a question, and then he'll answer them simultaneously.
Who's the Republican nominee for president going to be?
There you go. There's one.
I've heard in several political texts a comparison of interventions in other countries to a venture capital fund, where even if it doesn't succeed often, the returns from a success can be huge. So my question is, if we're not going to intervene often, and granted, we don't do that right now in terms of treating things like a venture capital fund, we're selective. How would you select when we should intervene and at what point in a conflict?
World War II, I said, made money for us. Most interventions do not. One left argument that I thought was incorrect at the time, I voted against the Iraq War. But the notion that we intervened in Iraq for oil, if we did, it was an even stupider decision than I thought it was, and it's the stupidest decision I ever saw any president ever make. We lost money on all these things. They are all enormously costly. For one thing, and it's this, we will not send people into battle unless they are as well equipped as it is possible to be, and it is very expensive. And so, no, I cannot think of a military intervention that paid off for us. I think what Clinton did in southern Yugoslavia was a good idea, but we didn't make any money off it. It always costs us money. What are the grounds for intervention? Good question. In general, if you have a functional society, this is the easy one, that is being invaded by another power, then there is the moral justification for trying to protect them. That was Hussein and Kuwait. You throw him out of Kuwait and you leave Kuwait alone. You do not allow people to be overrun. I think the French have done a good job of intervening in their former colonies. I thought the French intervention in Mali was useful. They knew the culture and they helped dispel brutal murderers. So those are very limited cases. One moral criterion is your likelihood of success. There is no moral justification for taking on a hopeless task where you're only going to make things worse. You may feel better. In terms of American security, it is rare. We are so big and so strong that it is hard to decide that. There is the possibility. I might say I might make one exception. If we were convinced that that lunatic in North Korea was planning a nuclear attack that would wipe out millions of South Koreans, I believe a preemptive strike would be justified. The problem there is the pragmatic one. And, people like to criticize America. I got to say, you want to criticize somebody? The Chinese refusal to put any restraint on the North Korean regime is outrageous, irresponsible, and not in their own self-interest. So those would, very rarely would it be that we had this interest. In general, and then there's one other, invasion of one to the other. And this is the Rwanda case. It is to prevent genocide. I think bombing those vicious thugs that call themselves the Islamic State was entirely morally justified, and we've done some useful stuff there. So those would be the limited times in which I would do it. Intervening, we say, well, we don't intervene. Intervening in a country that is badly governed to try and improve the quality of its governance, I've never seen that work. And I would not do that. As to the Republican nominee, I got to be careful about wishful thinking. If it were either Cruz or Trump, I would like it. Here's the reason, not just because we would do well. The biggest problem in America today, from our overall political system, is the right wing taking over the Republican Party. I did a lot of good, as recently as 2008. I recommend you want to question me on this. I'll talk about this when we have a panel. Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson, George W. Bush's two top economic advisors, I am proud to say speak very highly of me in their books. I worked with them. The Republican Party then sort of moved right. But the Republican leadership is now reaping what it sowed. They just leaped on this anger, frustratingly for us. It happened under them. We got blamed because we had to deal with it. And they stoked up their people to the point at which they now wish it hadn't happened. So here's the deal. It might be Rubio. Rubio troubles me. I think he would be very right-wing, but it appears more plausible. Although apparently, I didn't watch the debate, but I guess he was really just an incredible disaster. And if he is not able to get rid of Christie and Bush and Kasich in New Hampshire, then he's badly hurt. Interesting what people think about him. That Lindsey Graham, who's one of the smartest of that more establishment wing, when he dropped out, endorsed Jeb Bush, not Rubio, because he obviously thinks a little of Rubio. So without that, I honestly don't know. I was more inclined to think it would be Cruz and Trump, but at first I thought the Republicans would back Cruz to stop Trump, the establishment. Now it looks like they'll back Trump to stop Cruz, who they really, apparently, I've never encountered a major political figure who engendered as much visceral dislike from everybody else he deals with.
Was that something you noticed when you were in Congress?
Not with Cruz. No, I didn't serve much with Cruz. I just saw the efforts. By the way, interesting. I'm very, Neither Cruz nor Bernie Sanders gets any support from the colleagues. Cruz has one, Bernie has two, but they're very different reasons. In both cases, it's concern about electability. In Sanders' case, it's a concern about the practicality of his approach. Nobody dislikes him. In Cruz's case, people just hate him and really dislike him. So a week ago, I would have told you Rubio. Now I think Rubio may have been fatally wounded by this. And he's got this problem, you know, if a man with greater gravitas had done what Rubio did, he might have survived it. But he looks young and he looks inexperienced, so I think that would be a problem. So I just don't know. It's Rubio, Cruz, or Trump, and I'm now thinking more like it may be Cruz. Which, and this is what I forgot. If it's either Cruz or Trump, the Democrats will win very big. One exception: if Bernie Sanders should win the nomination, it seems to be highly unlikely. If there's Sanders and either Cruz or Trump, then Mike Bloomberg's in the race, and nobody knows what, without question, nobody knows what happens. So I will be for Sanders over Bloomberg. That will be an easy one for me. But if either Cruz or Trump wins, here's the deal. I'll close with this. There are an awful lot of Republicans, mainstream conservatives, not the liberal Republicans. They all died off. No more Tom Campbells in that party. But the mainstream conservative Republicans are troubled, but they're afraid to take the right wing on. They're angry, they're fierce, they're tough in the primaries. At this point, many of the mainstream conservatives are more afraid of tangling with the right in the primary than in the election. But if it's Cruz or Trump, the consequences electorally, certainly if it's Cruz or Trump against Hillary Clinton, the electoral consequences for the Republicans will be so devastating that the mainstream Republicans will have no choice but to fight back out of survival. At that point, the certainty of decimation in November will embolden them to take on the Republicans. And we may, by 2018, if that's the case, get back to a healthier situation, a sensible conservative party, a sensible liberal party, the way we were up until 2008.
Well, with that happy thought, why don't we finish up?